Hi, folks. This is Amy Chen Mills with Moment of Truth, and tonight we're running a special rerun of a show I produced for Unheard Voices some years back, which is still very relevant today. It is an interview I did with my former colleague at Metro Newspapers, Michael Mechanic, now a senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine, and his book called Jackpot: How the Super Rich Really Live. And I think it's relevant because so much of our world is faltering because of wealth hoarding and greed. And the question really is, what is all that actually worth? Michael talks about how wealthy people have a lot of complications in their lives and difficulties and stresses that they could avoid by not hoarding wealth. So this is the kind of topic I think we should all be thinking about and sharing with others. I hope you enjoy this special Moment of Truth rerun episode with Michael Mechanic, senior editor of Mother Jones Magazine and author of Jackpot. Before I get into the whole bio, I just have to say it's a very special interview for me because Michael and I used to sit with our desks directly across from each other, face to face, only blocked by our computers, at the Metro Santa Cruz office back in, Michael, 1992, 1993. Do you remember?
That's right. Yeah. It was around then.
Yeah, around then. Buzz Bazour, if some folks out there know, Buzz Bazour was our editor. Michael, were you the news editor for a little while?
Yeah, I was a staff reporter, and then then I was news editor.
Right. So this was back in the day when the Pono Grill, which may not even be open anymore, but was the last thing. There was the Java House Cafe, if folks remember the Java House.
Oh, it's gone now?
Yeah, it is. I know. But there was a really cool venue called the Pono Grill Hawaiian Food Bar and Music. That was kind of cool for a while. I think they may have shut down due to the virus and the stay-at-home orders, but we'll see. We're not sure what has survived and what hasn't yet. But let me introduce you formally. So now a senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine, where he writes and edits everything from breaking news to award-winning essays and feature stories. Born and raised in Madison, Wisconsin, he earned degrees in biochemistry and cellular and developmental biology from UC Berkeley and Harvard before heading back to Berkeley for his master's degree in journalism. Wow. Early in his career, he spent several years as a staff writer with me and news editor at Metro Santa Cruz, which was in the little building across from Java House, where he wrote a local music column and played in local bands. Some of you may remember Michael from a zine that he launched called Monkey Magnet and a record label called Bad Monkey Records, which released a pair of Santa Cruz compilations. Michael now lives in Oakland with his wife, a couple of teenagers, a cat, and a hedgehog, which I'm really curious about, named Snoop. He plays 5 musical instruments in his spare time, and Jackpot is his first book. So again, welcome, Michael.
Thanks so much.
You know, I think what I'm really curious about before we get into this book, which is I've seen a picture of Elizabeth Warren reading this book, so seems like it's making the rounds, is how, just really quickly, what was your trajectory after Metro Santa Cruz? When did you, and how did you end up at Mother Jones?
Well, my wife was also a reporter, and she was working for the Monterey Herald down in Salinas, and she had wanted to move back up to the Bay Area, and so eventually I relented, got out of the Santa Cruz cocoon, and
right.
we moved, and we're living in Oakland, where I kept running the record label, which was a labor of love. Never made any money off it.
Right.
And then, got a job as sort of on the night copy desk at the old San Francisco Examiner. There weren't very many journalism jobs available at that time, especially up around the Bay. And of course, they've been shrinking ever since. But
right.
I did later manage to land a job as a copy editor at Mother Jones, but that was back in the day. Mm-hmm. Ended up going with the .com boom. I joined an environmental news startup called Verde, which never actually launched. So, for like 6 months after working really hard to get this thing going, we all got laid off.
God.
A week later, I got a job at the Industry Standard because then everyone was hiring, right?
Yeah.
Ended up being a staff writer and and editor there. And eventually we all got laid off again because the whole, .coms went all down the tubes, as did the media that were covering them.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, I got fired on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle.
There you go.
Because I hadn't heard. We were on a week-long furlough, and my editor couldn't get a hold of me. So somebody tossed the paper into the motel room where we were staying, and it said, "Industry Standard pulls the plug." And I was like, "Oh my god, I don't have a job."
Kind of like Jim Comey, huh? I think that's how Jim Comey.
Oh my god, you learned it on television. Yeah, it's so bad, how awful. So then I was unemployed for a while, just freelancing, and then I got hired as managing editor of the East Bay Express, which I'd written for before.
It's a great paper.
It was, yeah. Well, it was. It sort of declined a lot.
Okay.
They just like the whole all weekly universe. The money is dwindled. It's been really hard for all weeklies to survive anymore. But I love the freedom of it. You could, as from Metro Santa Cruz, you could write about anything you wanted. You could write at length. Back then, there was a lot of space.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I remember an article you wrote about a botched penile implant.
Yep, unhung hero.
Oh my God. It was the most painful story to read.
Well, for men. Yes. Oh my gosh. Or for biological men, I should say. So, but then you ended up at Mother Jones, and I've been surprised. I've seen Mother Jones editors on like MSNBC, and are you getting ready to do this kind of thing? Or have you already been doing it? Because Mother Jones seems to have, I mean, I don't know what the circulation is, but it seemed like kind of sort of just an only far left mag for a while. And now
that was the reputation. It's always had that reputation, and it's always portrayed in the news media as being this lefty rag,
Right.
When in fact, I mean, yeah, sure, it's a progressive magazine, but it does great investigative journalism.
Right.
That's sort of what we're known for.
Yeah.
And, we will do like profiles of conservatives and, whatever. It's like we might look at our stories through a progressive lens, but we also just are good reporters. And we do really important stories. There's been we've been leading the way on a lot of the vote suppression stories. Ari Berman. Yeah. And he was just on the Ezra Klein show, so a lot of our reporters, as we started to kind of really gear up online. So we're really a daily publication as well as a bi-monthly publication. And our reporters are constantly, on television, on the radio, etc. Now, as an editor, I wasn't so much. In fact, I kind of avoided that because, I'm just sound stupid, right? But actually, after this book came out, I've been doing it a lot.
Wow.
And it's not nearly as frightening as I expected.
Yeah. So Local Boy Makes Good. This is Michael Mechanic, former staff writer for Metro Santa Cruz, now author of a book that just came out from Simon & Schuster. I can say that 3 times fast. Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. There's so much to get into around this book. And we're now talking about his career at Mother Jones Magazine and Mother Jones itself. And in fact, as a former investigative journalist, I was tracking Mother Jones pretty closely because you were writing about Donald Trump reading Hitler's books, and things that were very important, I thought, in 2016 before the election then, that a lot of media was not picking up on, and also including the chat boards that QAnon came from, and what was happening on 4chan and 8chan and 8kun. I was finding that Mother Jones was kind of picking up on things that a lot of other more mainstream media outlets, if you can say that, were not and still aren't really reporting, I don't think, very well. I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I would
say I feel like we are somehow able to punch way above our weight. We're a pretty small operation, but when I look at kind of what we're doing, especially online, and the way we're able to respond to, really big news events, it's kind of astounding, that we could kind of be up there with the big fish.
Yeah.
I'm really proud of the work we do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm proud of the work you do too. I'm proud of you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. It's so exciting. I saw you at Bookshop Santa Cruz did a little
Zoom meeting with you when we were back in lockdown, and I think I kept typing in the chat box, "Tell Michael it's Amy. I used to sit right across from him." And then I was like, "Oh, I'm probably being really distracting."
I'm sure I didn't look any older either.
No, you look probably younger, maybe 5 years younger than before. So now when you came out with this book, I was also excited because I have taken the path of, I'm still a writer. I write essays on Medium and still consider myself a journalist because I do a lot of research and I post a lot about politics and so forth. But I've been doing mental health work and spiritual work for about 30 years now, actually. That's where I went after journalism, after I left Metro and became a freelancer. And then I dropped all that and really got into trying to help people psychologically and spiritually. And also, I've been a climate activist recently. I was one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion Santa Cruz. I don't know if you know much about, I imagine you would know a little about Extinction Rebellion, the global movement. But what I keep coming back to is this, sort of what I see as the root of all of these terrible problems that we have, including climate change, climate crisis, we could say, climate emergency, the income disparities that you talk about in Jackpot. I keep coming down to is this worth it? It seems to me that it's this people wanting to be wealthy, having an image of wealth as being sort of the ultimate goal and happiness and fulfillment. And you write about this very well in your book. You really document it very well. But then I keep thinking, I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true that actually wealthy people are super happy. And I have a book here I'm also going to quote from as we go along called The Golden Ghetto, which is almost like a first version of your book by Jessie H. O'Neill. This was out in the 80s, and I can't find her. I believe she's in her 80s. She may have passed on. I've been trying to find her. The Golden Ghetto, the Affluenza Project was her major project as someone who was very wealthy and found she couldn't get psychological or spiritual help because people think wealthy people are they don't want to help them. And I think you found that too. Did you find that?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, there's a whole fairly recently, there's a whole industry that's built itself up around providing that therapy for very wealthy people.
Right.
And everything from literal therapists to, the wealth industry itself,
right,
which actually is, I've got to say, is a huge perpetuator of inequality just because of its incentives. But it's expanded to include psychologists and to include people who are family specialists and people who can work on educational issues. And you see this very wide range of services being offered to the very wealthy now, because the very wealthy can't go talk to their friends about this stuff.
Yeah.
Even their wealthy friends, there's such a taboo about talking about our own personal wealth in this society, which was one thing that made the book challenging, because I had to find people willing to talk to me about it, especially on the record.
Right.
And surprisingly, a lot of them would talk on the record. But then others wouldn't, because they say, my family would never let me talk about this, or I'm worried about my safety. And there's a lot of these things that come with wealth that are not positive things.
Yeah. And we tend to be angry at wealthy people, I think. I mean, when I talk to leftists, for example, when I'm posting on social media, writing something on Medium, and I get pushback, it's from the left. I get pushback from all sides, but I often get eat the rich kind of, right? And I understand the sentiment, because I think, so many of our problems are related to this idea of endless growth, right? Especially the climate crisis. But you speak of at the very end of your book, when you talk about sort of solutions, and what you see is really not demonizing the wealthy, but humanizing the wealthy so that dialogues can happen.
Yeah, I still believe that. I'm a little cynical about our ability to turn things around, even though, the book ends on a fairly, I'd say, an optimistic note, and I struggled with it.
Yeah.
Because do we want to just be all gloom and doom, we're screwed, or do we want to say, look, we've seen some progress with all these terrible things happening all at the same time, has opened a lot of eyes. I mean, I think there are people. I mean, look at Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos's ex.
Yeah.
who is shoveling money out the door as fast as possible.
Yeah.
She's giving to sort of causes that are not traditional philanthropic causes. She's giving to groups that she's done research on. These are groups that are actually trying to change the system and level the playing field. And that's not very common in philanthropy. Most philanthropy tends to be sort of self-aggrandizing, self-perpetuating. It's like either putting Band-Aid solutions on things or building an homage to the person who's the giver.
Right. Yeah, I was reading that in your. By the way, folks, he covers all of this in the book, including what is it? Mackenzie Scott is her name. Bezos's ex is doing. She's given away billions, from what I understand.
Well, yeah, it's like more than $8 billion in the last year or so. And, but the trouble is, I mean, look at what's happened to her wealth. It's gone up more than that. It's like she can't give it away fast enough.
Right. Well, that's okay as long as she keeps giving it away.
well, she will. But the thing is, a lot of people use philanthropic foundations as kind of almost, as a business enterprise, as a way to kind of further their own reputations, and they may have some good intentions, but ultimately they're not really making a sacrifice here.
Right.
And I talk about this, like, what good, a sacrifice without actually giving anything up. What kind of sacrifice is that, right?
Right. Right. You talk about that too, the philanthropy, and also how a lot of these foundations are actually promoting perhaps causes that are actually creating more income inequality. And actually, I've got so many, what are these things that you put on? Oh God, I can't remember. I've got so many dog ears on your book. And Post-its. Thank you. My producer just reminded me of the name. Let's go back, though, to just the basic psychology, because this is where I think people have a sense, like this is where we could all mature as a society, is understanding really the limits of how wealth can make us happy or not happy, right? How much can it really make us happy? And you mentioned this man named Richard Watts, who is a consigliere for some of America's richest families. So he gets close to them, I guess. And he regales me, you say, with stories of aimless and ungrateful heirs, of philandering husbands and gold-digging spouses, of a client reduced to tears in her oceanfront mansion at the sight of a group of beachgoers grilling hot dogs below. I love this part. It's very touching because she could no longer relate. She said, "I don't have anything in my life that feels like that. It's always charitable dinners and fancy things. Nobody's there to share simple pleasures."
Yeah, I think that you find in these ultra wealthy havens, you're separated from other people physically.
Yeah.
You all of a sudden you're far from your neighbor's house. You don't ever really bump into them,
Right.
So you kind of lose, and a lot of people are absentee owners in these communities. So you lose this sense of cohesion and community. I mean, I was talking to a guy who lived in Pacific Heights in San Francisco, and he said, well, the people who bought this house next door, they've been renovating for 3 years. I've never met them. Across the street, there's this movie producer. He's never there. He lives in Malibu. He has 4 other houses. It's like that. He says, these, I'm sure they're all nice people, but you would never borrow sugar from them.
Right.
And so, but it's not only the neighborhood. There's a social isolation because people feel a lack of trust. When at a certain level of wealth, people start worrying about who can I confide in, who is looking for a piece of me. People are always coming at you when you have a lot of money. You get a million solicitations. And the other side is the more, in a way, the more money we have, contrary to the way it was in the fantasy world of, Gilligan's Island or whatever, the more money you have these days, the more you tend to work. And so people's lives are kind of consumed with gathering and hoarding and protecting their wealth. And the money becomes a much bigger presence in your life.
Yeah, that's interesting because this book, The Golden Ghetto, I don't know if you've heard of this book because it seems a little bit obscure now, but Jesse O'Neill talks about workaholism as something that really isolates the family founder, the one that's generating the wealth, as well as individual family members. And there's an absence of parents and a turnover of reliable caretakers, which creates abandonment and trust issues for the children of affluence, and that this follows them into their adulthood. I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues here, including, one of the biggest ones is, she says, workaholism, what you're talking about. And then also, one thing she says is workaholism and trying to, like, as you're saying, hoard and keep and grow your money, which is something you're probably expected to do if you have money. Heaven forbid you should lose your money, then, and you look like an idiot, right? So you have to make sure you're growing it. So it becomes like a full-time job.
Yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, this sort of idea that, well, okay, so I reached this lifestyle and now I got to maintain this lifestyle and even expand on it. I talked one of my sources. I don't quote him on this in the book, but he was saying there's a huge pipe flowing out of here of cash.
Mm-hmm.
I spend so much money now.
Mm-hmm.
This guy says this $10 million house. He's making huge salary.
Mm-hmm.
This guy in particular he's just very, very highly paid,
mm-hmm.
extremely highly paid, and he said, but it's incredible how much money you can spend.
Yeah.
If you start living like this.
Right.
And another guy who had sold a company, walked away with $40 million, told me that once you are stopped with the wealth creation part of it, and now you you've cashed in and you're sitting on this giant pot of money, he said your whole mentality shifts and now you're worried about keeping the money. How am I going to keep this money?
Right.
And the word he said, you're fear-based now. Fear-based.
Yeah.
And I'm like, God, that sounds like
hell.
Yeah.
But then they can't complain, right? Because then we're all like, I remember a friend of mine who became a surgeon, and I saw him go from like an apartment to a condo to a townhouse to a huge townhouse to a house to a huge, like a mansion with wings, in Rancho Santa Fe and down in San Diego. And when he bought that house, I remember coming to visit him, and I remember looking at him and saying, I'm just going to call him Bob. Hey, Bob, this is it. I think you've hit the American dream. This is it. I said, and now you have no more excuses to not be happy. And when I said it, I could feel the constriction of the statement,
Mm-hmm.
like now there is no excuse really. You have everything money could buy,
Mm-hmm.
Horses. He was playing polo, flying around, private jet, this kind of thing.
Polo.
Yeah.
What you're saying is exactly what this high level wealth psychologist in my book said.
Yeah.
He said his clients are generally 100 million and up.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I find that they actually have a disadvantage in happiness.
Yeah.
Because he said, we have this societal belief that despite what our mothers told us, that money will buy you happiness. If only I had this, I'm going to be more content. So people have this striving. Oh, the reason I'm not satisfied is because I don't, because I don't have the vacation house, whatever it is.
Right.
And then all of a sudden they have everything they could possibly need or want, and they're still not happy. And so they have no, like you said, they have no excuse anymore.
Right.
It's like, oh, okay, maybe it was something else all along.
Right.
And of course it is. If people who study, Harvard did an amazing study that went over generations of people, and it's still going on. There's an interesting TED Talk about it. You can find it. I'm blanking on the name of the guy who's running it now.
Mm-hmm.
But
Post-it? Was his name Post-it?
Yeah, exactly. That's hilarious. But what he said, basically they looked at families over multiple generations, and they had picked a bunch of Harvard students as sort of their wealthy people,
Mm-hmm.
and then they had gone into like working class Boston and recruited these kids, and then they just followed them for generations. And throughout the thing, they find that what makes people happy is ties to the community.
Mm.
All the things that I talk about in the book as extrinsic values or intrinsic values, which is sort of community mindedness, making deep friendships and bonds and helping others and doing all these things. Whereas extrinsic is all the things we associate with commercial success: looking good, outward appearances, how nice our house is, how high status our job is, all these things. And so you find, that's maybe a little of that makes some people feel happier or more proud of who they are and what they've achieved. But all in all, it's a losing game.
Yeah.
If you get wrapped up in it.
Yeah. And you mentioned also that in the book, and so does Jesse O'Neill in The Golden Ghetto, that there's this, it's a comparison thing, really. You could have $100 million in the bank or 200 or 300 or whatever. But if your neighbors have twice as much, you still feel like you don't have enough.
Yeah, and we always compare upward and not downward. We don't look at everybody and say, "Oh my God, we're so much better off than 99.9% of the world."
Right.
We look up at that 0.001% above us, and we're like, "Oh, and there's always somebody that's going to be better looking and richer and have better taste than you." I mean,
well, not than me. There's not going to be someone who has better taste than me. But go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, okay, so there's a lot in this book. In fact, I have so many Post-its. We're not going to be able to get to all this, but just, there's a lot about the psychology of wealth. There's a lot about the problems of wealth. There's a lot about the fears now that the wealthy have. And one really interesting thing that you write about is the wealthy people pay very close attention to what is being said about them. Is one thing, and they're frightened, actually, that people will get angry. I read about this too, I think, in the New Yorker, where they were building bunkers, to be able to, hide from the pitchforked masses, right? And
right.
And they actually have these bunkers in New Zealand and probably all around the United States where they're ready to fight off the crowds, when the revolution or whatever happens. And I keep thinking, why? It just seems so insane. It seems like that. There's a simple answer, which I think you address at the end of the book, which is why keep hoarding wealth? Why do we want to keep this income disparity going? And there's a lot you write about in terms of income disparity. But just one question before we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about much more that's in this book. But there's also this thing. This is what scares me, Michael, and I'm hoping you can calm me down, which is that we saw the last president with malignant narcissist, if not sociopathic tendencies, as far as I'm concerned, that could be diagnosed this way. And then I was reading about, or hearing about that a lot of CEOs are actually sociopaths or malignant narcissists, that they tend to go into those positions because they'll do anything to get ahead, for themselves. And I don't know is that true? I mean, and is it something we need to worry about, or did you find that, or did you? I mean, you mentioned here a growing body of research further suggests that extrinsically oriented people are more likely to behave selfishly and engage in antisocial acts, more manipulative, less socially inclined, etc., more likely to harbor environmentally destructive attitudes and behaviors. But do you think that's a real issue, or is that just something that we don't need to think about anymore? Which would be great.
Well, the thing is, the research in wealth psychology, you don't get super rich people volunteering for these studies.
Yeah.
So they tend to be like they look at gradients of relative wealth, and so the upper end of that might be like the bottom of the 1%. So there's not a lot of hard data on what like really, really wealthy people look like psychologically. It's just anecdotal, and you hear a lot of anecdotal stuff. It's like I cannot paint all the types of people who become CEOs. You can't paint them all with the same brush. I would say though that one guy I talked to in the book, he's a guy named Doug Holliday, and he started a nonprofit called Path North, and his whole thing is he takes I think it's a nonprofit, it could be a for-profit. Anyway, he takes these very, very high status men, CEOs, senators, they tend to be very wealthy or very prominent, and he takes them on these disruptive journeys of self-realization. So, anything from taking them to the silent retreat at the monastery and where they can't speak for 3 days, or I talk in the book about how they bring them to they brought him to this restaurant in Jerusalem or the East Bank called Dana Noir, which all the owners and the servers are all sightless, and they make everybody sit in pitch blackness to have the 2-hour meal. So it's supposed to be this whole experience, right? So he will bring them on these experiences, and then they unpack it and have discussions. And this is supposed to be a venue where these guys who can never talk to anybody about this stuff candidly will talk about their fears and insecurities and all this kind of thing. And he told me that, he said, these guys, these CEOs, they've been grooming themselves their whole life. Like their whole life has been building a brand and pushing further forward toward this elusive goal or whatever of being, the best and getting all this recognition and so forth. And they just don't do any work on themselves. They don't know who they are.
Right.
They feel lost and lonely and isolated, and they're just hiding behind this big drive for status. And, you can't say that for everyone, but there seems to be some truth in that. And this guy actually, that's what he does for a living. He interacts with these people. Now, they might be self-selecting.
Right.
Like the people who, who feel that way and are trying to get some help for it go to him, when really it's a very pampered way of self-realization, right?
Right. Although I have a Post-it right here, speaking of Holiday, where he says, there's all kinds of data on CEOs that, oh my gosh, they're just dying emotionally. They're lost and they're dying. It is a nonprofit here. It says it's a nonprofit his website is Path North, or the company is called Path North. Mm-hmm. And then up above on this page, you talk about actually there are some studies that say that, or at least people who have tried to do this anecdotally, getting people to think about intrinsic values led them to be more interested in helping poor people in other nations and fighting climate change. So there's a little bit of hope in that sentence there. And we're here with Michael Mechanic, the author of Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. He's a senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine, used to be a staff writer here in Santa Cruz at Metro Santa Cruz. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with Michael Mechanic.
KSQD thanks GPI Builders for supporting this program. GPI Builders is a locally owned and operated full-service construction company with more than 10 years of experience and expertise. GPI Builders specializes in home additions, ADUs, and residential remodels throughout the Bay Area. For more information, 1-800-916-8343 or gpibuilders.com. Thank you, GPI Builders, for supporting community radio, K-Squid.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Unheard Voices on K-Squid, KSQD 90.7, your ink spot, and on the FM dial, and also live streaming at www.ksqd.org. And our Unheard Voices today, interestingly enough, are millionaires and billionaires, the most wealthy people in our nation. Michael Mechanic, a former colleague of mine at Metro Santa Cruz, now an editor at Mother Jones Magazine, a senior editor, has just put out a book called Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. He's done a tremendous amount of research, and I'm about to get into something that, hopefully everyone out there in Radio Land will stay tuned with us as we talk about tax codes. Michael, I have to hand it to you. You actually sat down and researched U.S. tax code. How did that go for you?
Oh, it's very exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, but, it's not to get too into the nitty gritty, but, almost every aspect of our tax code is skewed toward the wealthy.
Yeah.
And a lot of it has been for a long time. I mean, we have a progressive income tax. So as you make more, the higher portion of your wealth gets taxed more. So that's fairly progressive, but other taxes are not. So when people talk about the income tax, that's one thing, but then there's also property taxes and sales taxes and corporate taxes, and these things all sort of come together. And that's just not to mention the ways that wealthy people, because they have access to lawyers and accountants and this whole army, I call it your entourage, your financial entourage, have all sorts of opportunities, to get involved in really, really lucrative businesses that most of us cannot be, that actually aren't allowed to invest in.
Yeah.
And also just to avoid taxes in some ways that once you dig into the details, it's pretty extraordinary. We've been hearing about some of it recently because ProPublica has put out a few really good pieces. One a couple weeks ago was about ways that super wealthy people avoid paying income taxes altogether. And essentially, if you have a big pot of capital, stock investments, assets, and so forth, you can not sell it. So you're not paying any capital gains taxes on the sales and the gains from that. So you hold on to that and you borrow against it. And it's very easy for wealthy people to borrow a lot of money. Banks practically throw money at you at low interest.
Yeah.
And so, you might pay a few percent on some big loan, which you're borrowing against your assets. And, then you can, when it comes time to pay that loan, you can take out another loan and pay that,
Yeah.
And you can kind of keep piggybacking these things on one another. And in the process, you can live very well and have no income on the record. So Jeff Bezos was one of the people that, what was stunning about ProPublica, they actually got tax records from real, from the billionaires. So they got some, was probably all redacted, but they were able to cross-check it and figure out who was who. So they could tell us that, here's how much, here's Jeff Bezos paid no income taxes this year, Elon Musk paid no income taxes that year. And so there was one thing that really stands out. Bezos was able to get a $1,000 per child tax credit because he qualified because his income was so low. And we're like, oh my God. I mean, it sounds, okay, so that sounds insane.
Yeah.
You say, what an evil guy, right?
Uh-huh.
But the fact is, I'm sure he never even saw that, right?
Right.
It's all his tax lawyers do this stuff. They're
Right.
going to take advantage of everything.
Right. Yeah. And go ahead.
Right,
Sorry.
right. No, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, we definitely want to hear from you. You're the author, but I just, there are things that I read about in your book in Jackpot, like if you have a certain amount of money, some like a net worth of $3 million or something, you actually go into a different investor status class. And so therefore you can actually make better returns on all your investments. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, essentially when the SEC was created in the 30s,
Mm-hmm.
the whole idea of this bill was called the Securities Act of 1934, I think. This was a time when, it was it was post-Gilded Age, but there was a lot of shady business operators going around, and a lot of people would get ripped off. And so Congress came in and said, well, we have to protect the consumer here. So we're going to create a system wherein if you want to sell shares in a company to the public, you have to go through this process. You have to file a prospectus and give all the information that a reasonable investor would need to be able to evaluate, the merits of your business.
Mm-hmm.
So that became what public companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they also said that if you wanted to get around this and do it privately, you could, but then only sophisticated investors or accredited investors could get in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And these days, I don't remember what it was then, but these days to be an accredited investor, you need at least $1 million in addition to the value of all your other assets, like your house. So you have to have basically $1 million sitting in the bank that you can invest.
And then what does that mean you get to do?
It means that you can now get into real estate partnership funds, private equity, venture capital,
Right.
hedge funds.
Right.
Like you and I, Amy, could not go invest in a hedge fund.
Right. Oh, we couldn't. Okay. Well, damn.
We
Okay.
can't by law. And
Mm-hmm.
we say not only that, but even if we could by law, these funds, they don't care about the small fry, right?
Right.
They don't want your $10,000 or $20,000. They want somebody who's going to throw in, $500,000 or $1 million at a time.
Right.
So otherwise, you're making $1 billion fund. You don't want to have 10,000 million investors. You want to have 40.
Right. Right.
So it's sort of both the desire of the people who run these big funds and the actual law that says the little guy can't get in on the action.
Right. And one of these investors was saying, hey, I can make pretty much I'm going to make 7% plus or whatever. Everyone else out here is like, whatever we can make, right? If we're investing in the stock market or real estate or whatever else.
I mean, 7%, like in the past couple of years, it doesn't sound like much, but he's saying year in and year out,
right,
he can grow his entire asset base by 7%,
right?
Whether times are good or times are bad,
right? And that's saying something. Mm-hmm.
That is saying something. Mm-hmm. So it's very reliable,
right?
And I've heard that from other people too.
Just to remind everybody that you're at KSQD, ksqd.org, and also 90.7 in the Monterey Bay area on your FM dial. We're talking to Michael Mechanic, who is the author of Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. We're talking about how right now wealthy people just basically get wealthier all the time because the system is set up that way. I just want to mention that here in your book, Michael, I highlighted this part. The first 3 quarters of 2017, as Republican lawmakers unilaterally hammered out cuts that would add an estimated $2.3 trillion to the national debt, tax cuts. A brigade of 6,243 lobbyists depended upon Capitol Hill, mainly to pursue the interests of corporations, industry groups, and wealthy business owners. That's more than 11 lobbyists per lawmaker. And now, on the next page, it talks about trimming. So what happened in the last 4 years, Collins and his Republican colleagues, Chris Collins, New York representative, trimmed the top individual tax rate to 37% and slashed the top corporate rate from 35 to 21%. There's just so much in this book about what, if you don't follow Bernie Sanders on social media, then, read Michael's book, because then you can learn about what's been happening in terms of how the wealthy are paying less and less taxes. We've heard this from Bernie Sanders. A lot of us are hearing about the wealth gap and inequality. Is there anything that you learned that was surprising to you? Go ahead.
What's surprising is we've all known that this stuff's going on.
Yeah.
The devil's in the details. And it's like when you actually dig in, you find out the crazy degree to which the wealthy are advantaged. That's when it gets, it's fascinating and infuriating. Let me just give you an example.
Sure.
Okay, well, first of all the wealthy people go, oh, wealth tax, that's a bad idea. Mm-hmm. No wealth tax. That would, that would hurt industry and hurt innovation and hurt investment and whatever. So they have their argument. We do have a wealth tax. It's the property tax. And guess who is hit hardest by property tax? The middle class. Mm. Because, the middle class family has, on average, like 60% of their wealth tied up in their house.
I see.
If a 1%er has 7% of their wealth tied up in their house.
Wow.
So right there, you have a wealth tax that is going in favor of the rich.
Right.
Here's another one, sales taxes. Mm-hmm. They're incredibly regressive. If you are in the lowest income 10% of the population, you pay about 10 cents per dollar of your income in sales tax. If you're in the 1%, you pay 1 or 2 cents.
Wow.
And that's because of what gets taxed. Uh-huh. So if you buy a $100 million yacht, mm-hmm. First of all, you can completely get around the sales tax for that. But then there are some states that just have caps on sales tax for boats. So in New Jersey, I think it's $22,000. In Florida, it's $18,000. So, you could buy a $10,000 boat or a $20 million boat and pay similar sales taxes.
Wow. Yeah, I know. I think you have a story of people taking their lawyers out into the ocean on these yachts or boats so that they can do the paperwork in a place where they don't have to pay the taxes.
They go outside of the physical jurisdiction. And this was in a magazine called Marlin Magazine. It's like a yachting magazine.
Oh, I get that magazine. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I do. And it said that you should take a picture of the signers with a GPS unit that shows the latitude and longitude so you can prove it later.
Right. Oh, my gosh. Okay. So now there's so much to get through. We're running out of time. So, but I wanted to say that here's something that freaked me out. I did not know this. Okay. This is about what has happened to the IRS. from 2010 to 2018, even as the IRS received 9% more tax returns, its budget was slashed by $2.9 billion, a 20% reduction that cost the agency more than 1/5 of its workforce. Investigations of non-filers plummeted, and the amount of outstanding tax debt the IRS formally wrote off, based on the 10-year statute of limitations for collections, more than doubled from less than $15 billion in 2010 to more than $34 billion in 2019. What the heck is going on? I mean, so now we're not even collecting taxes. Okay, so people are avoiding taxes, but then if they're not paying, we're not even collecting. Virtually no partnerships were audited in 2018. By then, with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, the kneecapped IRS was scrutinizing the individual returns of just 0.03% of $10 million plus taxpayers, down from a peak of 23% in 2010. From 23% of $10 million plus earning taxpayers to 0.03% in 2018. Is that right? Am I seeing this right?
Yeah, that's right. What happened is the Republicans gutted the IRS. They, starting in 1994, they sort of went on a rampage, and they wanted to eliminate, reduce the budget. The IRS is so easy to hate. Nobody likes the IRS, right?
Right.
Nobody was really standing up to defend it. But this is how our government is funded. You have to collect the money.
Right.
But they were making it really easy for high-income people to cheat and get away with it. And that we're seeing a lot of that cheating happening. And, we need to rein it in. But the IRS has lost the expertise and both the expertise and just the numbers to be able to audit those people and to figure out, because these people file returns that are incredibly complicated.
Right.
And they're deliberately complicated. They have these partnerships, and people can't figure out who the partners are, because you have one partnership will be a partner in another partnership will be they have these chains of opacity. And these very smart lawyers have figured out how to befuddle the IRS and waste a lot of their time. So they'll throw up their hands and say, forget it.
Yeah.
And so you got some billionaire making out. I don't want to give people the impression that this book is going to be mind numbing, because it's not.
No, you're very good. You have stories.
Section, right?
Yeah.
I dig into a few little nuts and bolts of this stuff, just because you have to understand some of it. But it's also, it's not a lecture book at all.
No, it's not.
He's from Mother Jones. It's going to be one of those lefty screeds. No, it's not. It's a book that sort of sets out to look at the wealth fantasy run amok, but look at it through the eyes of the wealthy and their opportunities, and just sort of the crazy things that happen when that wealth fantasy gets fulfilled.
Yeah. And I want to just mention too that you have a chapter called Thriving While Black. And this is totally highlighted and underlined and post-it noted in my copy of the book. And you go over a lot of things that, a lot of us have been learning, and many people knew before, but a lot of us have made a point to really learn about how intergenerational wealth was handicapped for Black people, and tremendous obstacles were put up to creation of wealth for Black people after the Civil War and all the way up until today. So there's a whole chapter here on redlining and the Homestead Acts and how white people had access to land and communities and money that Black people actually did not. The Southern Homestead Act you talk about, and how many white people, 48 million Americans, are direct descendants of those Homestead Act beneficiaries who are white, right? So now people are trying to say, well, the playing field has been level for some time, but that's not the case. So I'm trying to kind of summarize here. You also talk about women and what it gets in the way of women accumulating wealth, and how women actually run, when they are managing money, they do a very good job. But often their funds, their mutual funds or hedge funds or whatever they're doing, aren't funded well enough because men see women running them and don't invest. Is that Is that accurate what I'm saying there?
That's right. I mean, essentially, women who manage to get access to capital or who even get into the room, because both like the finance industry and the venture capital industry are very male.
Yeah.
And in fact, all of the most lucrative industries, it's just as far as sheer money, they're almost entirely male. It's like 80%.
Yeah.
Especially in like leadership, even like corporate law, like partner levels in law firms, it's like 80% men. So, women are at a big disadvantage when it comes to wealth building. And if, let's say you're a woman, you want to start a company. Well, where are you going to get the money? First of all, you have a smaller network of just people who have connections in finance, typically.
Right.
And the same if you're a person of color. It's like white men just have bigger networks because they hang out with each other, and there's just more white men with, connections to those lucrative worlds. Now, suppose you have a good friend, you're a woman, you have a good friend who works in venture capital, can introduce you to this guy who, and then you're invited, you can go, they say, yeah, let's take your pitch. You can go into the room, and the room is a conference room with 6 or 7, probably mostly white guys sitting around, and you got to make your pitch. And there is, as much as all the critical race theory people hate the word implicit bias, there's an implicit bias there against women.
Yeah.
You have to work, all the women, like they say, you got to work harder. You got to jump through more hoops in order to get their confidence.
Right.
Because you, to that group, even though they may feel that they are completely egalitarian, but there's just something that's baked in. It's like they are the sort of stereotype of the rock star entrepreneur is not a woman.
Right. And even though, as you're saying, women tend to be less risky in terms of how much, they move stocks around and so forth. And so they tend to actually manage money very well.
Yeah, they don't do it by their gut. And
yeah.
they're not constantly trading. Like men trade way more than women do.
Right.
Women are, so yeah, sure, you might get lucky, but women actually, in the long run, they perform better.
Yeah.
Because if a woman and man are both doing it, because women are more deliberative about it. And the same goes like in philanthropy and so forth. And
yeah.
The same goes when you're allowed to make financial decisions for your family, because traditionally, if you were female, you were shut out of financial decisions of like a wealth, because it's usually the husband making all the money in these families. The husband has the big company, and
right.
And the wife was shut out of the financial decisions. And in fact, when a husband died, a woman would go to the bank, and she was at the mercy of male bankers and male accountants, and just sort of treated like an afterthought. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. The woman would voice concerns and questions, and for a long time, they would not give her the time of day.
Right. Well, don't get me started here, but.
I mean, things are definitely getting better.
Yes, but it's a mixed bag for me, because I'm like, well, okay, great. So we want to push women forward, and do we want more people in general, whether women, whether Black people, whether Indigenous people, or Latinx people? Who, I mean, one of the problems we're having as a society is this idea that creating wealth is like the best, most amazing thing you can do. That's the American dream. I just want to, because we're going to have to wrap up soon, I'm going to talk to you about what you see as some of the solutions. But I found this book in the library as I was getting ready to interview you, Michael, Happy as a Dane, 10 Secrets of the Happiest People in the World. This book by Marlene Rydal is about Denmark and Danish people. Danish people pay almost 60% in taxes, a marginal tax rate of 60% for incomes of around $59,000 a year at the time that she wrote this book, which I'm not going to take the time to look right now, but they pay a heck of a lot more tax than we do. And they consistently rank as the happiest nation, like on earth, in terms of well-being and free time and feeling free to live the kind of life they each want to live. I was going to try to pull in some spiritual authors too, but we're not going to have the time. Just talking about, a spiritual author who's also a coach to CEOs, who was talking about, when I talk to them, it's like they're glazed over. Their eyes are glazed over when they talk about their vision and their mission in terms of their companies. But when I ask them what their dreams have been in the past, and they talk about, planting gardens and farms and working with, low income kids, and their eyes just light up, So there's something very wrong with how we've set up the American dream. And you talk about this thing called, is it called mobility optimism? Where we are just constantly fed this idea that even if we're not doing well as a country in terms of mobility, we still have mobility optimism.
Right. We think we're going to be that guy who gets ahead.
Right. Even if we're not. I think you said 23% of us really aren't. So, but just
more than that.
More than that, yeah. I'm just going to say, what do you think is the best solution? Because I know at the back you talk about and really getting wealthy people involved in all of this, talking about this and not demonizing them so that they can participate in solutions, but you're going to have to make it really short. We've got about a minute left. So
yeah, well, it's just like, just the sort of debate about how does a Trump fan, how does a non-Trump fan talk to a Trump fan, right?
Right.
How can you bridge that divide if you can bridge that divide? I think with you were talking about the Danes. Well, they've developed a cultural attitude to say, well, I work 3 days for the state and I work 2 days for myself.
Right.
And the idea is that when you have a society that's supported in the middle, like if everyone feels safe and secure and supported, you just have a lot more stability and feeling of community and contentment, and a lot less resentment.
Yes.
And the resentment goes both ways. The poor people look at the rich and go, what a bunch of bastards. And the rich people look at the poor and they go, those people are lazy takers. And so you get this misunderstanding. I think on a human level, if those people actually ever talk to each other, they've got some common ground.
Right. Michael, I'm going to have to jump in because we're on the radio here. But
yeah, right.
We're talking to Michael Mechanic. He's the author of Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Maybe we can get you on again. Michael, if you're up for it later.
Anytime.
We're going to have to go now. Moment of Truth gives many, many thanks to our team, Nyanko Nyasu, sound and tech engineer, and our research and production team, Nyanko, Mei-Ling Obinata, Todd Zimmerman, and Vara Ramakrishnan. Todd Zimmerman of Native Verse Studios created the theme song. Kathy Krizik created our logo. Find our podcast of this show and others at all your favorite podcast sites under Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. Episode notes and links to resources are at our program page at www.ksqd.org. Thanks to our KSQD program manager, Howard Feldstein, and the entire KSQD team on the California Central Coast. Please contact us at amy@ksqd.org with questions or comments. And remember, if we don't use our democracy, we lose our democracy. Okay, thanks everybody. Peace out.